My wife lost her memory 7 years ago. We thought it was just a tragic accident, a cruel twist of fate that took the brilliant woman I loved and left behind an empty, silent shell. But yesterday, my son and I took her to a new neurologist. When my son stepped out of the room to take a business call, the doctor leaned across his desk. His face was completely pale. He looked me dead in the eye and whispered, "Keep your wife away from your son." Before I could even process the words, before I could ask him what he meant, the door clicked open. My son walked back in holding something in his hands, and in that fraction of a second, my heart completely stopped. My name is Victor Caldwell. I am 70 years old, a retired structural engineer, and I am still trying to process the absolute nightmare my life became. For 4 decades, I built bridges and commercial high-rises across the country, believing that a solid foundation could withstand absolutely any storm. I spent my entire life working myself to the bone to provide for my family, to build a fortress of security for my wife and my only child. But I never realized that the most devastating collapse would happen right inside my own home, engineered by the very flesh and blood I spent my life protecting. Before I tell you the rest of this terrible story, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. It brings this old man a lot of comfort to know who is listening out there in the world and what time of day it is for you. And if you have ever had to protect someone you love from the people you thought you could trust the most, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss my next stories. The air in Dr. Gregory Lynn's examination room was freezing and smelled strongly of clinical antiseptic and rubbing alcohol. I sat in a stiff plastic chair, gently holding Diane's fragile hand in mine. My beautiful wife was 68 years old, but the agonizing trials of the past 7 years had weathered her into someone who looked much, much older. She sat next to me in her wheelchair, staring blankly at a generic medical poster on the far wall. Her fingers were completely limp and unresponsive inside my grip. She was physically there, but her brilliant, vibrant mind had been locked away in a dark, impenetrable fog for years. Standing on the other side of her wheelchair was Preston, my son. He was 40 years old, wearing an immaculate, custom-tailored navy blue suit. His hair was perfectly styled, and his heavy luxury watch gleamed sharply under the harsh fluorescent ceiling lights. He looked every bit the ruthless, successful hedge fund manager he had become. To anyone else in that room, he was the absolute picture of a devoted, loving son, taking precious time out of his frantic, high-stakes schedule to accompany his aging parents to yet another medical specialist. Dr. Lynn sat behind his desk, staring intently at his computer monitor. We had come in for what I thought was a routine follow-up checkup. I was desperately hoping this new, highly recommended doctor might offer some experimental therapy or just a fresh perspective on Diane's rapidly declining condition. Dr. Lynn had ordered a massive, comprehensive blood panel a week prior, something far more extensive than our previous doctors had ever bothered to do. I watched the doctor carefully. The silence in the room stretched on, becoming thick and suffocating. The only sound was the rapid clicking of his computer mouse. Dr. Lynn did not speak. He just kept reading the screen, his brow furrowing deeper and deeper with every line of data he scrolled through. I could see the muscles in his jaw clenching. Suddenly, Preston's phone buzzed loudly in the breast pocket of his suit. He pulled it out, glanced at the glowing screen, and let out an annoyed, exasperated sigh. "Dad." "It is the Chicago office," Preston said, flashing me an apologetic, perfectly practiced smile. "I have to take this. I will be right back in 2 minutes." He patted his mother gently on the shoulder, squeezed my arm with reassuring affection, and stepped out into the hallway, pulling the heavy wooden door firmly shut behind him. The exact moment the heavy brass latch clicked into place, the entire atmosphere in the room completely shifted. Dr. Lynn abruptly turned away from his monitor. The polite, calm, professional bedside manner he had carried since we walked in completely vanished. The warm color had drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen shade of gray. He pushed his rolling stool back, stood up, and took 2 quick, urgent steps toward me. He did not speak at a normal volume. He leaned in so close I could feel the nervous heat radiating from him. He looked frantically at the closed door, then down at my helpless wife, and finally directly into my eyes. "Victor," Dr. Lin whispered, his voice trembling with a raw, desperate urgency that sent a shockwave of cold fear straight down my spine. "I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need you to not react." I stared at him, completely frozen. My mind tried to comprehend what was happening, but my voice utterly failed me. "You need to get her out of your house," the doctor continued, his whisper barely above a breath, but echoing in my ears like a blaring siren. "I am looking at her toxicology report right now. Victor, you need to keep your wife away from your son." I felt the air get violently sucked right out of my lungs. Keep her away from Preston. What on earth was he talking about? My brain rejected the words instantly. Preston was the one who paid for her expensive at-home medical care. Preston was the one who meticulously handled all her daily medications. Preston was the perfect, dutiful son who visited every single day. I opened my mouth to demand an explanation, to ask this doctor if he had completely lost his mind. But before a single syllable could escape my lips, the brass handle on the door turned with a sharp, heavy click. Dr. Lin instantly snapped backward, grabbing a random clipboard from the counter and pretending to examine it with deep medical concentration. The door swung wide open. Preston walked back into the room. He tucked his expensive phone into his pocket, offering that same polished, flawless smile to the room. But it was not the smile that made my blood run ice cold. It was what he was holding in his other hand. It was a tall, red, stainless steel thermos. The paint was slightly chipped near the lid from years of relentless daily use. It was a completely ordinary object, something I had seen 1,000 times, but seeing it right after the doctor's terrifying warning made my stomach violently turn over. "All sorted," Preston said smoothly, pulling his chair back and sitting down beside us. "Sorry about that, Dad. The financial markets wait for no one." He unscrewed the top of the red thermos. A faint, earthy, slightly metallic aroma drifted out and hung in the sterile air of the clinic. "Time for your herbal smoothie," Mom, Preston said. His voice was soft, melodic, dripping with the patience of an absolute saint. He slowly lifted the thermos toward Diane's chapped lips. For 7 long years, I had watched this exact ritual. I had watched it with a heart full of desperate gratitude for a son who cared so deeply for his broken mother. But right now, with Dr. Lin's desperate warning screaming in my mind, every single movement Preston made felt heavy, calculated, and deeply, terribly wrong. Diane did not look at him. She was still staring blankly at the wall, lost in whatever dark fog clouded her mind. But as the cold metal rim of the thermos touched her bottom lip, something inside her reacted. It was not a conscious, deliberate movement. It was a raw, primal, instinctual flinch. Her frail hand suddenly twitched upwards weakly, pushing the heavy red thermos away from her face. The sudden jerky motion caused the thick, dark liquid to slosh over the edge. A few large drops splashed directly onto my bare wrist. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself not to pull away or shout. The liquid was warm, but the exact moment it soaked into my skin, it caused a strange, sharp, burning sensation. It stung deeply, like a harsh chemical irritant eating into an open wound. I looked down at my wrist, watching the dark stain seep into my pores, and my mind was violently pulled back to a rainy Tuesday afternoon 7 years ago. I remembered the sickening, heavy thud echoing through our hallway. I remembered rushing out in a blind panic to find my brilliant, vibrant Diane crumpled at the very bottom of our grand oak staircase. That brutal fall had supposedly shattered her skull, and eventually her entire mind. Since that exact day, ever since she came home from the hospital, as a confused, terrified shell, Preston had stepped in. He had personally researched and blended this thick, dark botanical tea for her, serving it every single afternoon without fail. He claimed it was an expensive, holistic remedy to soothe her damaged neurological pathways. I had never questioned it once. I was just an exhausted, grieving husband trying to keep my crumbling world together. But as an engineer, I know that a fresh coat of paint can hide a crumbling foundation, but a structural crack always makes a sound before the collapse. Sitting in that freezing clinic room, feeling the chemical burn on my wrist, and seeing the unnatural stillness in Dr. Lin's terrified eyes, I realized my entire family was a house on the verge of a catastrophic collapse. I looked up at Preston's face. He was wiping the spilled liquid from Diane's chin with a pristine white handkerchief, his movements so gentle, so meticulously careful. But there was a tightness in his jaw, a cold, absolute dead focus in his eyes that I had never truly noticed until this exact moment. He was not looking at a mother he loved. He was looking at a task he needed to complete, a problem he needed to manage. "Dad, is everything okay?" Preston asked, catching my intense stare. His voice was perfectly level, perfectly innocent. I forced the muscles in my face to relax. I forced myself to smile the tired, clueless smile of a broken old man who relied entirely on his successful son. "Yes, Preston," I said, my voice completely steady despite the hurricane of panic destroying my insides. "Everything is fine. I am just a little tired today." "Good," he murmured, turning his cold eyes back to his mother. "Come on, Mom. Drink up. It is for your own good." I sat there, in the sterile silence, watching my wife swallow the dark liquid, feeling the burn on my wrist pulse like a warning alarm. I did not say another word. I just watched. But the old engineer in me was officially awake. The blueprints of my life had been completely falsified, and I was going to tear down the walls to find out exactly who signed off on the destruction of my family. The ride down the hospital elevator and into the underground parking garage was a masterclass in suffocating silence. Preston pushed his mother in her wheelchair, with the practiced ease of a dutiful son navigating the crowded corridors while responding to a work email on his phone with his free hand. I walked a few paces behind them, my mind racing 1,000,000 miles a minute. The faint burn on my wrist throbbed beneath my shirt cuff, a constant reminder of the doctor's whispered warning. "Keep your wife away from your son." The words echoed relentlessly in my head, drowning out the ambient noise of the hospital. We reached Preston's luxury SUV, a massive, spotless black vehicle that smelled of expensive leather and absolute control. He lifted Diane from the wheelchair, murmuring meaningless comforts, and buckled her into the passenger seat. She stared straight ahead through the windshield, utterly disconnected from the world. I climbed into the back seat, sinking into the plush leather, feeling more like a prisoner than a father, getting a ride from his boy. Preston folded the wheelchair, loaded it into the trunk with a heavy thud, and slid into the driver's seat. He started the engine, the motor humming to life with barely a whisper, and we pulled out into the afternoon traffic. For the first 15 minutes, the only sound was the low rhythm of the tires on the asphalt and the soft classical music playing from the car speakers. I watched the back of Preston's perfectly groomed head. I needed to test the waters. I needed to see how the concrete would react if I tapped on a load-bearing pillar. "Preston." I began, keeping my voice mild and slightly raspy, playing the part of the tired, overwhelmed old man perfectly. That appointment was certainly strange, was it not? I have never seen a doctor react quite like that to a standard blood panel. Preston glanced at me through the rearview mirror. His eyes were calm, utterly devoid of any panic or guilt. "What do you mean, Dad?" he asked smoothly, keeping his attention casually on the road ahead. Dr. Lin seemed very professional to me. A bit stiff, perhaps, but capable. I shifted in my seat, rubbing my stinging wrist under my sleeve. He seemed alarmed. I continued, letting a note of genuine parental concern slip into my tone. "Just before you walked back in with the thermos, he looked completely pale. He was muttering something about the test results. It makes a man worry, Preston. You know how much I worry about your mother." Preston let out a soft, dismissive chuckle. It was a perfectly executed sound, designed to make my concerns feel foolish. "Dad, you have to remember that these clinical neurologists are incredibly rigid. They look at a chart, they see an anomaly that does not fit their textbook training, and they panic. They lack vision." I paused, letting the silence hang for a moment, before pushing a little harder. "He seemed particularly interested in what Diane was ingesting," I said, keeping my gaze fixed on the back of his neck. "That smoothie you make her. What exactly is in that red thermos, son? You have been making it every single day since she came home from the hospital 7 years ago. I know you say it is for her nerves, but what are the actual ingredients? Preston did not miss a beat. His shoulders did not tense. He simply reached out and tapped the digital display on the dashboard. "Let us get Valerie on the line," he said, his tone entirely reasonable and accommodating. "She handles importing the supplements. She can explain it better than I can." The phone rang twice through the car speakers before she answered. Valerie's voice filled the cabin, crisp, energetic, and laced with that patronizing sweetness she always used when speaking to me. "Preston, darling, is everything all right? How was the appointment with the new doctor?" "We are on our way back, Valerie," Preston replied smoothly. "Dad is just asking a few questions about Mom's daily botanical blend. He said Dr. Lynn seemed a little confused by her blood work today." I heard a sharp, dramatic sigh from the speakers. It was a sigh of absolute put-upon exhaustion. "Oh, Dad," Valerie said, addressing me directly. "Please tell me you did not let that arrogant doctor get into your head. I warned you about these Western medicine specialists. They absolutely despise any treatment plan they cannot heavily bill your insurance for." "Valerie, I just want to understand what my wife is drinking," I said, maintaining my gentle, pleading tone. "It is a highly specialized custom Swiss botanical blend." "Dad," she explained, her voice gaining a sharp edge of authority. "We import it from a private holistic clinic in Geneva. It contains rare adaptogens and neurosoothing compounds that you cannot even get approved by the rigid agencies in this country. It costs us $2,000 out of pocket every single month, Dad. We gladly pay it, because it is the only thing that stops Mom from having those terrible, violent tremors. Remember how bad she was before we started the regimen? Do you want her to go back to shaking uncontrollably in her bed?" The guilt trip was deployed with absolute tactical precision. It was designed to make me feel ungrateful and entirely dependent on their generosity. We sacrificed so much to keep her stable. "Dad," Valerie continued, her voice softening into a counterfeit display of wounded affection. "Preston wakes up at 5 in the morning every day to measure and blend that mixture precisely to the milligram. We do it out of love. Do not let some ego-driven clinic doctor undo all the miraculous progress we have made over the years." I sat back against the cold leather, letting her fabricated guilt wash over me. To an outsider, it was a flawless, airtight explanation. I swallowed hard, playing my assigned role to absolute perfection. "You are right, Valerie," I murmured, letting my voice sound adequately ashamed and frail. "I am sorry. I am just a frightened old man, trying to understand things that are beyond my grasp. I appreciate everything you and Preston do for her. I really do." "Thank you, Dad," Valerie replied, her patronizing victory complete. "We will see you at home." The call disconnected, plunging the SUV back into silence. "You do not need to worry, Dad," Preston said softly. "I have everything completely under control." I nodded, looking at the back of his perfect suit, but then my eyes drifted down to the steering wheel. His voice was the picture of calm, confident reassurance, but his hands told a completely different story. Preston was gripping the thick leather of the steering wheel with such terrifying, brutal force that his knuckles were bone white. His fingers were locked in a rigid, desperate death grip, and his entire forearm was trembling violently against the console. The lie was absolutely perfect, but his body was screaming in raw, undisguised panic. He knew that I was watching him, and he was terrified of what I might actually be thinking right now. The rest of the evening passed in a suffocating haze of enforced normalcy. We arrived at our sprawling suburban home, the house I had designed and built from the ground up to be my family's ultimate sanctuary. Preston helped Diane out of the car, his movements as gentle and precise as a seasoned nurse. He guided her into the living room, settled her into her favorite recliner, and draped a soft woolen blanket over her frail shoulders. Valerie was waiting for us, offering a sympathetic smile and a plate of warm food that I could barely force myself to swallow. They moved around the house with total ownership, managing the caregivers, adjusting the thermostat, and speaking in hushed, respectful tones about my wife's tragic condition. To anyone looking through the front window, it was a moving portrait of generational love and devotion. But the faint, persistent stinging on my wrist was a constant, undeniable reminder of the doctor's terrified whisper. "Keep your wife away from your son." I excused myself early, claiming the emotional toll of the appointment had completely drained my energy. I retreated to the master bedroom, closing the heavy wooden door behind me, but I did not even attempt to lie down. I paced the floor in the dark, the silence of the house pressing down on me like a physical weight. My mind was a chaotic storm of memories, medical charts, and the image of Preston's white knuckles gripping the steering wheel. I am a structural engineer by trade, and my instincts have kept thousands of people safe over a 40-year career. I know how buildings breathe. I know how they settle into the earth, and I know exactly how they fail. People outside the industry look at a freshly painted wall and see a flawless, beautiful structure. They admire the crown molding and the polished hardwood floors. But an engineer does not look at the paint. We listen for the tiny, microscopic fractures in the concrete. We measure the subtle millimeter shifts in the load-bearing columns. Standing in the darkness of my bedroom, I applied that exact same logic to my son. Preston had painted a masterful facade. He was the wealthy hedge fund manager, the devoted child who stepped up when tragedy struck the pillar of strength for his aging parents. But the foundation was cracking. The sudden panic in the clinic, the elaborate lie about a Swiss botanical blend, the terrifying grip on the steering wheel, and the doctor who looked like he had seen a ghost. These were not minor settling noises. These were the sounds of snapping steel. I was sure. Around midnight, the house finally grew quiet. I heard the muffled sounds of Preston and Valerie retiring to the guest suite at the far end of the hallway. I waited another 30 minutes, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the study, before I silently opened my bedroom door. I stopped in the shadows, just outside the expansive kitchen. A single pendant light was illuminated over the marble island. Preston was standing there, fully dressed, in his suit trousers and a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He was holding the red thermos. I watched from the darkness as he moved toward the secondary medical refrigerator we kept in the pantry. He placed the thermos inside on the top shelf. Then he did something that made my breath catch in my throat. He pulled a small, heavy brass padlock from his pocket, threaded it through the metal handles of the refrigerator door, and snapped it shut. He then slipped the tiny key into his pocket and wiped his hands together, staring at the appliance for a long, calculating moment. Watching him secure that fridge with a padlock, a deep, bitter memory surfaced, raw and painful. 7 years ago, in the chaotic, devastating aftermath of Diane's terrible fall down the stairs, my entire world had stopped. She was in a medically induced coma, her brain swelling, her life hanging by a fragile thread. I could not leave her side at the hospital. I was a wreck, unable to focus on anything but the rhythmic beeping of her heart monitor. At the time, I was the sole owner and chief executive of a multi-million-dollar commercial construction firm, a company I had built with my own 2 bare hands. Preston, seeing my absolute despair, had stepped in to lift the burden. He brought me a temporary power of attorney document, urging me to sign it, so he could manage the firm's daily operations and handle the massive financial obligations, while I stayed home to spoon-feed my broken wife. I signed it without reading a single page. I handed over my life's work, my entire empire, because I trusted my son to protect our family. For 7 years, I let him run everything, completely isolating myself in this house to act as Diane's primary caretaker. Now, standing in the shadows of my own kitchen, a horrifying realization washed over me. Preston was not locking up a precious, expensive, holistic medicine to keep it safe from spilling. He was locking up a dangerous substance to ensure absolutely no one else in the house could ever access it. He was treating that red thermos like a highly volatile biohazard. It was not a cure. It was a mechanism of control. The intricate, horrifying pieces of the puzzle were finally beginning to align in my mind. The sudden transfer of my company, the absolute isolation of my wife, the daily dose of a mysterious dark liquid that he refused to let anyone else administer. He had trapped us in a prison of his own making, masking it all with the illusion of profound filial devotion. I retreated slowly to my bedroom, my heart pounding with a new dangerous rhythm. The paralyzing grief and confusion that had plagued me since the clinic visit evaporated, replaced by a cold, searing clarity. I was no longer just a frightened, confused old man watching his wife slip away into the shadows of dementia. I was a man who had realized his house was actively being demolished from the inside out. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at my hands. These hands had laid steel frameworks that touched the sky. They were strong, precise, and capable of dismantling whatever sick, twisted structure my son had built around us. I knew I could not confront him directly. He held the financial power, the medical proxies, and the legal upper hand. If I challenged him now, he would simply tighten the noose, perhaps institutionalizing both of us to protect his secret. I had to operate in the blind spots of his arrogance. He thought I was blind deaf and completely dependent. He thought I was just another load-bearing column he could manipulate. I looked toward the bedroom door, my jaw set with unyielding resolve. I was going to break into that refrigerator. I was going to test my gut feeling, and I was going to find out exactly what poison my perfect son was feeding my wife. I waited in the absolute dark of my bedroom until the glowing red numbers on the digital clock resting on my nightstand finally flashed 2 a.m. The sprawling suburban house was profoundly silent, deeply settled into the heavy, suffocating quiet that only arrives in the absolute dead of night. My heart was thumping a relentless, frantic rhythm against my ribs, a sensation I had not felt since my early days walking across narrow steel beams suspended high above the city skyline. I had spent the last 2 hours sitting completely still in the dark, meticulously planning out my next sequence of movements. From the bottom of my old leather travel bag, I retrieved a small, sterile glass vial I usually kept for storing my travel medications. I also grabbed a tiny plastic bottle of dark food coloring from a forgotten baking kit Diane used to keep hidden in her craft closet, along with a thin tension wrench and a curved hook pick from a specialized tool set I had kept since my days working on massive construction sites. Back then, managing multi-million-dollar commercial job sites meant occasionally having to creatively bypass jammed equipment lockboxes when my tired foremen inevitably lost their keys. I never thought in a million years I would be using those exact same lock-picking tools to quietly break into a refrigerator inside my own home. I slipped out of my bedroom, deliberately leaving my hard shoes behind. I moved slowly down the long hallway in my thick wool socks, placing my feet incredibly carefully on the very outer edges of the floorboards, where the wood was solidly braced by the structural joists directly below. I knew every single millimeter of this house. I had designed it myself. I knew exactly which floorboards would groan under a heavy step and which ones would hold my entire weight in total absolute silence. The descent down the grand oak staircase felt like an agonizing eternity. Every shifting shadow in the dark house seemed to maliciously stretch and twist, playing terrifying tricks on my exhausted, aging eyes. I reached the bottom landing and paused, holding my breath and listening intently to the house. Nothing. There was only the faint, distant hum of the central air conditioning unit gently kicking on. I crept forward into the expansive kitchen, silently bypassing the massive marble island, and headed straight for the secondary medical refrigerator tucked deep inside the walk-in pantry. The small, heavy brass padlock hung securely on the metal handles, gleaming faintly in the ambient pale moonlight filtering through the tall kitchen windows. I knelt down on the cold ceramic tile floor, carefully pulling a small penlight from my pocket. I clamped the tiny flashlight firmly between my teeth, freeing both of my trembling hands for the delicate work ahead. I inserted the tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway, applying a very light, steady pressure with my left thumb. With my right hand, I gently slid the curved hook pick deeply into the lock. The internal mechanism was surprisingly cheap, a standard brass tumbler that offered almost no real resistance to an experienced hand. I felt the first metal pin bind, then audibly click perfectly into place. Then I moved to the second. Then I pushed the third. A few seconds later, the internal cylinder gave way with a remarkably soft, yielding metallic click. I caught the heavy brass lock securely in my palm before it could hit the metal door and make a disastrous sound. I slipped it into my deep trouser pocket and gently pulled the refrigerator doors apart. A wave of cool artificial air washed immediately over my sweating face. There, sitting entirely alone on the top wire shelf, was the chipped red thermos. I reached out and firmly grabbed it. It felt unnaturally heavy and cold in my hands. I carefully unscrewed the metal lid, wincing visibly as the faint, metallic, profoundly earthy smell drifted out once again into the confined space. Working as quickly as my old hands would allow, I uncapped my sterile glass vial. I carefully poured about 2 fluid ounces of the thick, murky, dark liquid directly into the small tube. I sealed the vial tightly, ensuring it would not leak, and slipped it deep into my pocket for safekeeping. I then took the heavy red thermos over to the deep kitchen sink. I dumped the entire remaining contents of the dark liquid straight down the drain, watching it swirl and completely vanish into the dark plumbing pipes. I rinsed the thermos thoroughly with freezing cold tap water, making sure no residue remained on the stainless steel walls. I quickly refilled the container with fresh filtered water, meticulously adding 3 precise drops of the dark food coloring I had brought down with me from upstairs. I swirled the new mixture around in circles until it perfectly matched the murky, opaque visual consistency of Preston's supposed holistic herbal blend. I tightly screwed the lid back onto the thermos, wiped the stainless steel exterior completely clean with a dry dish towel, and tiptoed back to the dark pantry to place it exactly where I had originally found it. I was just reaching deeply into my pocket to retrieve the brass padlock when my blood ran entirely cold. A sharp, distinct, terrifying creak echoed clearly from the very top of the wooden stairs. Footsteps. Someone in the house was awake. The soft padding of bare feet grew steadily louder, moving methodically down the upper hallway and approaching the top of the stairs. Pure panic surged violently through my chest, like a sudden jolt of electricity. I had only seconds to react before I was discovered. I frantically looped the heavy brass padlock back through the metal handles of the refrigerator, pressing the shackle down hard until it clicked shut with a terrifyingly loud, metallic snap. The approaching footsteps were halfway down the stairs now. I looked frantically around the moonlit kitchen. There was absolutely no time to make it to the living room or dash down the hallway unseen. I threw myself backward, retreating deep into the dark walk-in pantry, pulling the slatted wooden door mostly shut deliberately, leaving only a tiny crack to see through. I pressed my back incredibly hard against the cool wooden shelves, hiding my body entirely behind a long row of tall cereal boxes and canned goods. I held my breath, clamping my hand forcefully over my mouth to silence my own ragged, terrified breathing. Through the narrow gap in the wooden door, I saw the overhead kitchen lights suddenly flick on, flooding the entire room in blinding, unforgiving brightness. Valerie walked directly into my narrow line of sight. She was wearing a long silk robe, her sharp, calculating features brightly illuminated by the harsh overhead lights. She walked directly toward the kitchen island, opening a wooden cabinet to grab a clear drinking glass. She moved slowly to the sink and turned on the running tap. For a horrifying, agonizing moment, she stopped completely and stared straight down at the stainless steel basin, looking at the exact spot where I had just poured out the entire contents of the thermos. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying to whatever higher power was listening that I had successfully washed away every last trace of that murky, toxic liquid. As a career engineer, I had spent my entire life relying entirely on precise calculations, undeniable facts, and guaranteed structural integrity. I never relied on simple luck. But in this terrifying, suffocating moment, Blind luck was the only thing keeping my family's dark reality from violently exploding. The silence in the house felt heavily oppressive, thick with unspoken secrets and malicious intent. I could feel the cold glass of the sterile vial pressing hard against my thigh, a tiny container holding a terrifying mystery that could completely shatter my entire world. I thought about Diane lying utterly helpless in the bedroom, directly above us, completely unaware of the chemical prison our own son had locked her inside. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal made me feel physically nauseous. I had to stay calm. I had to remain perfectly composed. I took a deep, shaky breath to steady my severely frayed nerves. My heart hammered against my ribs with such violence I was certain she could hear the thumping from across the room. I clutched the glass vial in my pocket, my fingers gripping it desperately like a lifeline. Valerie stood there for what felt like an absolute unending eternity, slowly sipping her glass of water, her cold eyes scanning the dark corners of the silent kitchen. She took one deliberate step toward the closed pantry door. My entire physical body went instantly rigid. If she opened this door, everything would be completely over. The vital element of surprise would vanish, and my son would know I was onto his sickening, twisted game. But then mercifully, she stopped. She set the empty drinking glass down on the marble counter, turned off the bright kitchen lights, and silently walked away. I listened to the soft padding of her footsteps slowly ascending the wooden stairs, eventually fading back into the deep silence of the upper floor. I slid down the pantry wall, sitting heavily on the cold tile clutching the sterile vial. I had the evidence. Now I needed the absolute truth. The morning sun bled through heavy curtains of the master bedroom, casting long, sharp shadows across the hardwood floor. I sat in my usual armchair, a cup of black coffee cooling in my hands, waiting for the daily ritual to commence. Exactly at 9 o'clock, the heavy oak door creaked open. Preston walked in, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, exuding the effortless confidence of a man who held the entire world in his palm. In his right hand, he carried the red stainless steel thermos. I watched him approach Diane's bedside, my heart thumping a steady, agonizing rhythm against my ribs. I had to bury every ounce of my rage behind a mask of exhausted gratitude. I gave him a weak, tired smile, the kind of smile a broken 70-year-old man gives his savior. Preston returned it with a look of profound, sickening pity. He sat on the edge of the mattress, unscrewed the lid of the thermos, and poured the dark, murky liquid into a small feeding cup. It was nothing but filtered tap water and a few drops of food coloring, but to Preston, it was his instrument of absolute control. I held my breath as he lifted the cup to Diane's lips. She swallowed the liquid mechanically, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. Preston gently wiped her chin with a tissue, his face radiating a smug, quiet satisfaction. He had absolutely no idea that his meticulously engineered structure had just been compromised. He patted my shoulder, told me he had a board meeting in the city, and confidently strode out of the room. I listened to his heavy footsteps fade down the hallway, followed by the distant slam of the front door. The trap was set. For the rest of the day, I watched my wife with the obsessive, relentless focus of an engineer monitoring a stress test on a critical support beam. I dismissed the afternoon caregiver early, claiming I wanted some quiet time alone with Diane. I pulled my chair close to her bed, tracking every single breath, every subtle twitch of her muscles. For the first few hours, nothing happened. The heavy, oppressive fog of the past 7 years seemed completely undisturbed. She lay there silent and motionless, staring blankly at the wall. Doubt began to creep into the edges of my mind. What if I was wrong? What if her condition truly was a tragic, irreversible neurological decline? But as the late afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the room in a dim orange glow, I noticed the first microscopic crack in the facade. The chronic, violent tremors that usually ravaged her hands right before dinner were entirely absent. Her fingers lay perfectly still against the white cotton sheets. Her breathing, usually shallow and erratic, had deepened into a steady, natural rhythm. The rigid tension in her jaw slowly relaxed. I sat frozen in my chair, terrified to make a sound, terrified to break whatever fragile process was happening inside her mind. The chemical chains were finally dissolving. I stayed awake long after the sun went down, refusing to eat, refusing to look away for even a single second. The house settled into a deep, heavy silence, but my mind was screaming with a mixture of overwhelming hope and absolute terror. I was waiting for a ghost to return to the world of the living. The hours dragged on with agonizing slowness. Midnight passed, then 1 in the morning, then 2. My eyes burned with exhaustion, but I forced them to stay open. The digital clock on the nightstand glowed with a harsh red light in the pitch-black room. It was exactly 4 in the morning when the unthinkable finally happened. The quiet rhythm of the room was shattered by a sudden, sharp gasp. I bolted upright in my chair, my heart leaping into my throat. Diane shifted violently under the heavy blankets. The slow, mechanical movements of the past 7 years were gone. She threw the covers off her chest with a frantic, uncoordinated burst of energy. I lunged forward, falling to my knees right beside the bed, hovering my hands over her shaking shoulders. Diane slowly turned her head toward me. The ambient moonlight from the window caught her face and I completely stopped breathing. The thick, impenetrable fog that had glazed over her irises for 7 agonizing years was entirely gone. Her eyes were completely clear, sharp, and intensely focused, but they were not filled with the warm, loving recognition I had spent thousands of sleepless nights praying for. They were wide, dilated, and filled with a raw, primal, absolute terror. It was a look of pure horror, the look of someone who had just woken up entirely trapped inside a burning building. "Victor," she breathed out. "My name." She said my name. It was a raspy, fragile whisper severely damaged by years of total silence, but it was undeniably her voice. The shock hit me so hard I felt physically lightheaded. I reached out to gently touch her face, to tell her she was safe, to tell her I was right here. But before my fingers could even brush her cheek, she lunged forward. Her frail, bony hands shot out of the dark and grabbed the collar of my shirt. The sheer, desperate strength in her grip was terrifying. She pulled me down toward her face, her chest heaving with rapid, panicked breaths. Her eyes darted wildly around the dark room, searching the shadows, as if expecting a predator to leap out from the corners. She looked back at me, her expression twisting in absolute agony. Her lips trembled violently as she tried to force her vocal cords to work. I leaned in closer, my ear hovering inches from her mouth, completely paralyzed by the sheer gravity of the moment. She tightened her desperate grip on my shirt collar, her knuckles turning white. "Key," she gasped out. It was just one single ragged word forced out with every last ounce of energy she possessed. "Key." Before I could ask her what she meant, before I could beg her to keep speaking, a sudden violent spasm tore through her entire body. A massive crushing migraine visibly struck her. She let out a sharp, agonized cry, her hands instantly releasing my shirt, to clutch desperately at the sides of her head. Her back arched sharply against the mattress, her eyes rolling upward as the overwhelming pain short-circuited her recovering brain. And then, as quickly as she had returned to me, she collapsed backward onto the pillows, slipping instantly into a deep, heavy unconsciousness. I was left kneeling on the hard wooden floor, completely alone in the freezing dark, my hands violently trembling. The room fell back into a suffocating, terrifying silence. Key. The word echoed relentlessly in my shattered mind. My wife was locked inside a chemical prison, and I had just heard the first agonizing transmission from the abyss. I knew right then, with a cold and absolute certainty, that I would brutally tear my own treacherous son apart piece by piece to find the exact hidden lock it truly belonged to. The pale morning sunlight filtered through the heavy curtains, bringing with it a profound sense of impending destruction. I had not slept a single second since Diane passed out in my arms. I sat in my armchair perfectly still, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest. She had not spoken again. The heavy chemical-induced slumber had reclaimed her, pulling her back down into the dark abyss. But the single word she had gasped into the silence of the night was burned permanently into my mind. Key. I repeated it over and over, turning it over in my thoughts like a jagged stone. At exactly 8 in the morning, the very heavy wooden front door swung open. I heard the sharp, rapid clicking of expensive heels on the hardwood floor. It was Valerie. She rarely visited this early in the day, especially unannounced. I quickly wiped my face, rubbing my eyes to manufacture the look of an exhausted, helpless old man, and walked out into the hallway to intercept her. Valerie was standing in the foyer holding a pristine white pastry box. "Good morning, Dad," she said, her voice dripping with that manufactured, sugary sweetness. "I brought some fresh croissants from the bakery downtown. I thought you might need a little pick-me-up after yesterday." I offered a weak, trembling smile, accepting the box with a shaky hand. "You are too kind, Valerie," I murmured. "I am just so incredibly tired today." I left her in the kitchen and walked back toward the master bedroom, leaving the door open just a crack. Valerie followed me a few minutes later, holding 2 cups of hot black coffee. She stepped into the bedroom, her eyes immediately darting toward Diane, who was sitting propped up against the pillows. Diane was still, but the absolute deathly rigidity was gone. Her hands were resting softly on her lap, and her chest moved with a natural, steady rhythm. Valerie walked over to the bed, setting the coffee down on the nightstand. "Good morning, Mom," she sang out, bending down slightly. Diane did not speak, but her head turned. It was a slow, deliberate movement. Her eyes locked directly onto Valerie. The vacant, empty stare was completely absent. Instead, a flicker of pure, unadulterated awareness flashed across the face of my wife. Her brow furrowed, and a tiny, almost imperceptible sound escaped her throat. It was not a word, just a soft vocalization of recognition and fear. The reaction was instantaneous. Valerie recoiled as if she had just been physically struck. The polished, dutiful daughter-in-law routine completely shattered in a fraction of a second. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin a sickening shade of gray. She stared at Diane, her breath catching audibly in her throat. "Dad," Valerie stammered, her voice completely stripped of its usual melodic tone. "Has she been like this all morning? Has she moved at all?" I played my part flawlessly. I slowly shuffled forward, looking confused and deeply concerned. "Like what, Valerie?" I asked, my voice wavering. "She seems a little more peaceful today, do you not think? Perhaps the new doctor was right to adjust our expectations." Valerie did not answer me. She practically sprinted out of the bedroom, the sharp clacking of her heels echoing wildly down the hallway. I followed her silently, staying in the shadows of the corridor. I watched her practically tear into the kitchen and head straight for the walk-in pantry. She stared at the locked secondary refrigerator, gripping the handle and pulling it hard to ensure the heavy brass padlock was still securely in place. She then yanked her phone from her designer handbag. Her thumbs flew across the illuminated screen with frantic, desperate speed. Her entire body was vibrating with raw panic. She rapidly paced back and forth in front of the massive marble island, biting her thumbnail, waiting for a response. The trap had finally been sprung, and the rats were just beginning to scramble. Within 3 short hours, the heavy front door burst open again. Preston marched into the house, his face a mask of absolute calculated rage, disguised as extreme medical concern. He had abandoned his usual pristine business suit for dark slacks and a wrinkled dress shirt. He looked completely unhinged. Valerie was right behind him, wringing her hands together in a theatrical display of profound anxiety. Preston stormed directly into the living room, carrying a thick, heavy manila folder tucked tightly under his arm. "Dad, sit down," he commanded, his voice completely devoid of its usual patronizing warmth. It was the sharp, commanding tone of an executive giving a non-negotiable order. I sat slowly on the edge of the sofa, letting my hands tremble violently in my lap. "What is wrong, Preston?" I asked, forcing my voice to crack with manufactured fear. Why are you both so upset? Is it your mother? Preston tossed the thick folder onto the glass coffee table with a loud, aggressive slap. He kneeled in front of me, placing his hands firmly on my knees. Dad, you need to listen to me very carefully, he began, his eyes locked onto mine with a terrifying, predatory intensity. Valerie called me this morning. She told me Mom was displaying unusual motor function and increased lucidity. I know you think this is a good thing, Dad. I know you want your wife back, but you do not understand what is actually happening. He paused, letting out a heavy, dramatic sigh. I spoke to Dr. Lin and our specialists in Geneva immediately. This is not a recovery, Dad. It is a dangerous terminal neurological spike. Her damaged neural pathways are misfiring violently. The sudden lucidity is a symptom of a massive impending catastrophic seizure. The holistic blend is no longer enough to suppress it. We have to move her tonight. I stared at him, letting my mouth hang slightly open in feigned absolute horror. Move her where, I whispered, clutching the fabric of my trousers. We have secured a bed in a highly specialized closed-ward psychiatric facility upstate, Preston said rapidly, not missing a single beat. They have the restraints and the chemical suppressants required to keep her from completely destroying her own brain. An ambulance is coming for her at 8 tonight. It is the only way to save her dad. You have to trust me. He pushed the heavy manila folder toward me across the glass table. I just need you to sign these transfer authorizations, he demanded, tapping a silver pen against the documents. It gives me the medical proxy to facilitate the move and authorize the heavy sedatives they will need to use during transport. Just sign the back page, Dad. We do not have time to waste. I ignored his tone and slowly opened the folder. The first 3 pages were just standard medical transfer forms. But as I turned to page 4, my blood ran cold. Hidden entirely inside an emergency proxy paragraph was a clause for the permanent transfer of asset management. They were trying to take my wife away, and they were trying to steal my entire remaining wealth. I stared at the thick black ink on page 4 of the legal document. Permanent transfer of asset management. The words blurred together as the horrifying scope of my son's plan finally crystallized in my mind. They were not just sending my wife to a high-security psychiatric ward to hide the fact that she was recovering. They were orchestrating a hostile takeover of my entire remaining wealth. Preston was using a fabricated medical emergency to force me into signing away my financial independence, my house, and my ultimate ability to fight back. If I challenged him right now, if I threw these papers in his face and accused him of poisoning his own mother, I would lose absolutely everything. He had the medical proxy, the clinic documentation, and the sheer physical strength to overpower me. I was a 70-year-old man standing alone in a living room against a ruthless corporate predator and his equally vicious wife. I needed time. I needed a window to spring the trap I had set with the glass vial sitting deep in my pocket. I took a slow breath, letting the air rattle in my lungs. I let the heavy manila folder slip from my trembling fingers. It hit the glass coffee table with a pathetic, defeated slap. I slumped forward, burying my face in my wrinkled hands. I forced my shoulders to shake, pulling up every ounce of genuine grief and terror I felt for Diane to manufacture tears. When I looked back up at my son, my eyes were completely red and overflowing with moisture. I allowed a long, pathetic sob to break through my lips. Preston. I gasped, my voice thin and entirely broken. You cannot do this tonight. You cannot take her away from me in the dark like some common criminal. She is my wife. She has been my entire world for over 40 years. Preston crossed his arms tightly over his chest, his face hardening into a mask of pure impatience. He glanced at Valerie, who rolled her eyes, letting out a sharp, irritated sigh. Dad, we have been over this, Preston said, his tone dripping with patronizing exhaustion. It is a medical necessity. If we do not transport her immediately, she could suffer a fatal aneurysm. The doctors have already arranged the specialized transport team. You are not thinking logically. You are letting your emotions endanger her life. I fell to my knees right there on the expensive Persian rug. The physical submission was the ultimate display of my completely manufactured surrender. I looked up at the two of them playing the role of the helpless, clueless old fool they desperately wanted me to be. 3 days I begged, letting my voice crack and pitch upward in absolute desperation. Just give me 3 more days. Let me say goodbye to her in the home we built together. Let me sit by her side and read her favorite books one last time. If you take her tonight, the shock will kill me, Preston. I swear it will kill me. Valerie stepped forward, looking down at me with an expression of profound disgust. Preston, we cannot delay the transport. The deposit for the private psychiatric suite has already been wired. If we wait, we lose the reservation, and your mother might have another episode. Let him have his 3 days, Valerie, Preston interrupted smoothly, holding up his hand to silence his wife. He looked down at me, his eyes gleaming with the arrogant thrill of absolute victory. He saw a broken, defeated old man kneeling on the floor, completely subjugated to his will. He believed his meticulously engineered structure had proven completely impenetrable. He believed he had won. I will call the clinic and buy you exactly 72 hours, Dad. Preston continued, his voice adopting that sickening, reasonable cadence once again. But you have to sign the transfer authorizations right now. All of them. I need the legal power to keep the psychiatric ward holding her bed, and I need the asset management proxy finalized so I can release the funds to pay for her extensive incoming treatments. You sign the papers tonight, and you get your 3 days to say a long, proper goodbye. After that, the ambulance comes and you do not interfere. Do we have a deal? I nodded rapidly, wiping my wet face with the back of my trembling hand. Yes, I whispered. Yes, whatever you need, Preston. Just please let me keep her here until Friday. Preston snatched the manila folder off the coffee table and shoved it directly into my chest, clicking his expensive silver pen and pressing it into my palm. I took the heavy pen, letting my fingers fumble clumsily with the slick metal casing. I opened the folder to the first page, staring at the little yellow sticky notes Valerie had meticulously placed next to every required signature line. I took a deep, shaky breath and pressed the pen to the paper. During my 4 decades running a massive commercial construction firm, I had handled thousands of highly sensitive multi-million-dollar contracts. In the vicious, cutthroat world of commercial real estate, fraudulent documents and hostile takeovers were a constant looming threat. To protect myself, my corporate attorneys and I had legally registered a very specific, highly classified security measure. My legally binding official signature required my middle initial, the letter M, written with a very distinct, unbroken loop connecting it to my last name. Any document I ever signed without that specific middle initial was immediately legally void, classified by my legal team as an invalid variant used strictly for draft reviews and non-binding preliminary negotiations. Preston knew absolutely nothing about this corporate safeguard. He had only taken over my company after I stepped away, and he had never bothered to learn the intricate, granular details of my personal legal defenses. I moved the pen across the thick paper, deliberately leaving out my middle initial entirely. I signed my first and last name with a jagged, trembling script, making it look exactly like the desperate handwriting of a terrified old man. I flipped through the pages, signing the medical proxy. I turned to page 4, staring directly at the permanent asset transfer clause, and signed that invalid variant once again. I repeated the deliberate mistake on every single line, handing the folder back to my son with a look of pathetic defeat. Preston snatched the documents quickly, flipping through the pages to verify the ink was in the right places. A chilling smile spread across his perfectly groomed face. "Thank you, Dad," he said smoothly. "You are making the right choice. We will see you on Friday morning with the transport team. Do not do anything foolish." I watched from the floor as Preston and Valerie strutted out of the living room. The heavy front door slammed shut behind them, sealing the house in silence. I stayed on my knees, listening to the distant sound of their vehicle pulling out of the driveway. Once the faint engine hum vanished completely into the night, the trembling in my hands stopped. The tears dried on my face. I stood up smoothly, rolling my shoulders back. The helpless old man vanished, replaced by the calculating engineer. They had given me 3 days. It was all the time I needed to completely and utterly destroy them. The heavy front door clicked shut. Preston and Valerie were gone. I pushed myself up from the rug. I had precisely 72 hours before that transport team arrived for Diane. I retreated to the master bedroom, where my wife slept deeply, her breathing steady and natural, for the first time in 7 years. The sterile glass vial was still burning a hole in my pocket, heavy with the toxic secret that had stolen her mind. The next morning broke with a dull gray light. I knew Preston too well to think he would leave us unmonitored. I had built this house mapping out every sightline and security angle, but Preston had updated the exterior cameras when he took over my construction empire. I had to assume that eyes were watching my every move. I spent the early hours playing my assigned role to absolute perfection. I shuffled around the kitchen in my worn slippers, my shoulders slumped in defeat, pouring a cup of black coffee with deliberately trembling hands. I sat at the island, staring blankly at the marble countertop, looking every bit the shattered, grieving husband, preparing for his ultimate loss. Around 9 in the morning, I began the mundane chore that would serve as my cover. I gathered the kitchen trash methodically, tying off the heavy plastic bags. I slipped my hand deep into my pocket, my fingers wrapping tightly around the cold glass of the sterile vial. I carefully transferred it to the inner breast pocket of my thick wool cardigan, zipping it securely shut. I took the heavy trash bags and slowly shuffled toward the back door. The morning air was biting and crisp, carrying the faint scent of impending rain. I walked down the paved driveway, my head bowed low, moving with the sluggish, labored gait of a broken man. I could feel the cold, unblinking lens of the security camera mounted above the garage, tracking my progress. I kept my face hidden, letting the collar of my cardigan shield my expression. Our property backed up against a narrow, overgrown alleyway that serviced the rear entrances of the neighborhood estates. When I designed the perimeter walls 4 decades ago, I had deliberately left a small, irregular blind spot directly behind the massive ancient oak tree that anchored the far corner of the lot. The sprawling branches and the angle of the tall brick retaining wall created a dense pocket of heavy shadows that no camera could penetrate. I reached the large plastic garbage bins lined up against the brick wall. I lifted the heavy lids, tossing the bags inside with a loud, hollow thud. I paused, taking a slow, deep breath, and took 3 quick, deliberate steps backward into the dense shadows behind the ancient oak tree. The alleyway was dead quiet, choked with wild ivy and forgotten debris. From the deepest part of the shadows, a figure detached itself from the brick wall. He stepped forward silently, chewing on the end of an unlit cigar. Mike Sullivan was 72 years old, but he still carried the broad, intimidating frame of the ruthless private investigator he had been for over 40 years. We called him Sully. We had grown up together in the same grit-filled neighborhoods, fighting the same battles. When I was building commercial high-rises, Sully was the man I called to quietly run background checks on shady subcontractors and corrupt city inspectors. He was my oldest, most trusted friend in the world, a man forged in absolute loyalty and unwavering grit. "You look like pure hell," Victor Sully rasped, his voice sounding like coarse sandpaper grinding against gravel. He did not step out into the light, keeping his broad shoulders firmly planted in the concealing darkness. He wore a faded trench coat and a dark newsboy cap pulled low over his sharp, observant eyes. "I feel like it, Sully," I whispered back, my voice tight with a mixture of immense relief and lingering terror. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. I know I did not give you much to go on when I called from the burner phone this morning. You said it was life or death." Sully grunted, shifting the unlit cigar to the other side of his mouth. "In 40 years, you have never used those exact words with me. So what kind of mess are we looking at? Your boy Preston finally crossed a line he cannot buy his way back from. I reached into the inner pocket of my thick wool cardigan. My fingers trembled slightly as I pulled out the sterile glass vial. The dark, murky liquid sloshed heavily against the curved glass walls. I held it out into the shadows. Sully reached forward, his large calloused hand wrapping securely around the small vial. He held it up slightly, squinting at the dark fluid. "Preston has been feeding this to Diane every single day for the past 7 years," I explained, forcing my voice to remain steady, despite the absolute hurricane of rage churning in my gut. He told me it was a highly expensive imported Swiss botanical blend to treat her neurological tremors. But 2 days ago, a new doctor looked at her blood work and practically begged me to keep my wife away from my son. I stole this sample directly from his private padlocked refrigerator in the middle of the dark night. Sully lowered the vial, his sharp eyes locking onto mine with a cold, terrifying intensity. The casual demeanor completely vanished, replaced by the ruthless, calculating operative I had relied on for decades. "You think he is actively poisoning her?" Sully asked, his raspy voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal whisper. "You think your own flesh and blood is keeping her locked in a chemical coma?" "I do not just think it, Sully, I know it," I replied, my voice hard and absolute. "She woke up last night. The fog completely lifted for just a few moments. She looked right at me and she was terrified. He is moving her to a closed psychiatric ward this Friday to hide what he has done, and he is trying to use the transfer to steal every last dime of my remaining wealth. I gave him a forged signature on the asset papers to buy me 72 hours. Sully let out a low, dark whistle, slipping the glass vial deep into the pocket of his faded trench coat. A forged signature. The old invalid variant trick from the downtown plaza contract days. You always were a clever bastard, Victor. But 72 hours is not a lot of time to tear down a fortress. That is why I need you. I need you to run a comprehensive toxicology screen on that liquid. I cannot use any local diagnostic clinics. Preston is heavily connected with the medical charity boards in this city. If I take this to a standard lab, his people will flag my name immediately, and the sample will disappear before it hits a microscope." Sully nodded grimly, slipping back into the shadows. "I will get you the absolute truth, Victor," he whispered, completely vanishing into the dark morning air. I watched Sully disappear into the thick morning fog before turning back toward the house. My hands were empty, but my mind was overflowing with a terrifying clarity. I had 72 hours to dismantle the fortress my son had built around my family. The first step was securing irrefutable proof of his actions within these walls. I could not simply rely on a private toxicology report. A chemical analysis would tell me what was in the thermos, but I needed to see exactly how Preston and Valerie operated when they thought no one was watching. I needed eyes in the dark. Later that morning, I told Valerie I was going to the pharmacy to pick up my blood pressure medication. She offered to drive me, her voice dripping with fake concern, but I stubbornly refused, playing the part of a proud, irritable old man clinging to his last shreds of independence. She relented, eager to have the house to herself, to finalize the psychiatric transport arrangements. I drove straight to a specialized electronics retailer located on the far edge of the city. I bypassed the consumer security aisles entirely and requested to speak with the store manager, a man who occasionally supplied discreet surveillance equipment to my construction firm back in the day. I purchased 4 military-grade micro cameras. They were incredibly sophisticated devices, smaller than a dime, equipped with ultra-high-definition lenses, thermal night vision, and encrypted wireless transmitters that would stream a live feed directly to my tablet. I returned home just after noon. The house was quiet. Valerie was upstairs on a prolonged business call, and Preston was at his corporate office. I knew I only had a brief, fragile window of opportunity. I retreated to the basement workbench and unpacked my tools. For 40 years, I had analyzed structural load paths, designed complex electrical grids, and engineered the hidden nervous systems of massive commercial high-rises. Wiring a few miniature cameras into existing household fixtures was incredibly rudimentary work for a man with my background. I disassembled the hardwired smoke detectors I had carefully unscrewed from the ceiling earlier. I meticulously integrated the tiny camera modules directly into the slotted plastic vents of the detector housings, tapping them seamlessly into the continuous electrical current of the house. The devices would never need their batteries changed. They would record endlessly, completely hidden in plain sight. I moved through the house with the silent, deliberate precision of a ghost. I installed the first modified smoke detector directly above the marble island in the kitchen, giving me a perfect, unobstructed view of the secondary medical refrigerator. I mounted the second camera in my old home office, a room Preston had brazenly taken over to manage his hedge fund. Finally, I crept into the master bedroom. Diane was resting quietly. I positioned a stepping stool near the center of the ceiling and installed the third camera, angling the microscopic lens to capture the entirety of her bed and the surrounding floor space. I cleaned up every speck of drywall dust, replaced my tools in the basement, and retreated to the guest bedroom. I locked the door and pulled out my tablet, booting up the encrypted monitoring software. The screen flickered to life, splitting into 4 crystal-clear, high-definition quadrants. The audio feeds were incredibly sensitive. I spent the remainder of the afternoon and evening sitting in my chair, staring intently at the glowing screen. I watched Valerie pace the kitchen while talking on her phone, complaining bitterly about the logistical annoyances of transferring Diane to the closed ward. I watched Preston return from the city, his posture rigid and arrogant, as he moved through my house, pouring himself a glass of expensive scotch in my office. They were completely unaware of the invisible net I had just cast over them. Night fell, plunging the large suburban house into darkness. The micro cameras automatically shifted into thermal night vision mode, rendering the rooms in sharp, glowing shades of green and white. I sat in the pitch black of my room, the bright screen of the tablet illuminating my tired face. The house grew still as midnight passed. Hour after hour came and went. I refused to close my eyes, fueled by a potent mixture of adrenaline and pure, unadulterated rage. I was waiting for the inevitable moment they would let their flawless masks slip. At exactly 2 a.m, movement flashed in the upper left quadrant of the screen. The hallway camera captured 2 glowing thermal figures moving silently toward the master bedroom. It was Preston and Valerie. My heart hammered against my ribs as I quickly tapped the screen, maximizing the feed from her room. The heavy wooden door creaked open, and they stepped inside. The room was bathed in the eerie greenish hue of the night vision lens. Diane lay completely motionless on the bed. Preston stood near the foot of the mattress, his hands planted firmly on his hips, staring down at his mother with an expression devoid of any human empathy. Valerie moved closer to the nightstand, checking the array of medical monitors and pill bottles. The highly sensitive microphone picked up the faint rustle of their clothing. Then Valerie spoke. Her voice was a harsh, venomous hiss, completely stripped of the sweet, accommodating tone she used in the daylight. "The old man is getting suspicious," Valerie whispered violently, glaring across the bed at her husband. "He was asking too many questions in the car yesterday. And that display he put on in the living room today. Begging for 3 more days. He is trying to buy time. I know it. He is a pathetic fool, but he is not entirely stupid." Preston scoffed quietly, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Let him be suspicious, Valerie. He signed the asset transfer authorizations. We have the legal proxies. In 72 hours, she will be locked securely in the psychiatric facility, completely inaccessible, and his entire estate will be permanently under our control. It does not matter what he suspects. He has absolutely no power left." Valerie leaned closer to Diane, her face hovering inches above my helpless wife. I watched the screen in absolute horror as Valerie reached into the deep pocket of her silk robe. She pulled out a small, unlabeled plastic bottle filled with pills. "We cannot take any risks right now," Valerie hissed, her voice trembling with a dark, malicious urgency. "Did you see her eyes this morning? The blend is losing efficacy. Triple her dose tonight. She cannot be allowed to remember the original will." I felt the blood freeze in my veins. My hands tightened around the tablet, my knuckles turning stark white. The original will. My mind violently reeled back to 7 years ago. Before her devastating fall, Diane and I had visited our estate attorneys to draft a highly specific ironclad joint will. We had structured it so that if either of us passed away or became medically incapacitated, the entirety of our wealth would bypass Preston entirely and be completely protected from his reckless greed by establishing unbreakable trusts. My mind violently reeled back to 7 years ago. Before her devastating fall, Diane and I drafted an ironclad joint will. If either of us passed away or became incapacitated, our entire wealth would bypass Preston entirely protected from his greed by unbreakable trusts. We knew he lacked the discipline to manage my empire. Diane was the primary executor. If she regained her cognitive function, if she remembered the legal safeguards she orchestrated, Preston would lose absolute control over my multi-million-dollar company. He would lose his hedge fund capital and his fabricated kingdom. The supposed tragic accident suddenly took on a sinister, murderous light. Did she simply fall, or was she deliberately pushed? I watched the screen in silent horror as Preston nodded slowly, taking the plastic bottle of pills from his wife. He crushed 3 pale tablets on the nightstand, using a water glass sweeping the fine white powder into Diane's feeding cup before adding tap water. He forced the liquid past her lips, gently massaging her throat to ensure she swallowed every drop. They lingered for a few more minutes, whispering reassurances to one another about the upcoming psychiatric transport, completely ignorant that I had documented every second of their treacherous crime. Once they turned off the lights and exited the room, leaving my wife to sink back into an unnatural stupor, I collapsed back against my chair. I sat in the pitch black of the guest bedroom, my blood running as cold as glacial ice. The absolute magnitude of their deception was staggering, but I still needed the chemical evidence to complete the puzzle. I needed to know exactly what weapon they had been using to steal my wife's mind. The agonizing wait stretched through the silent hours of the morning. At exactly 6:15, the prepaid burner phone hidden inside my travel bag began to vibrate against the hardwood floor. It was a harsh buzzing that shattered the quiet of the room. I snatched the device, pressing it tightly to my ear. I did not say a word. I just waited for the gravelly voice on the other end of the line. Victor Sully rasped, his voice sounding older, heavier, and far more grim than it had 24 hours prior. I got the lab results back from my private contact. You need to sit down for this, my friend. I am already sitting, Sully, I replied, my voice a hollow whisper. Tell me exactly what is in that thermos. Give me the unvarnished truth. I heard the sound of paper shuffling, followed by a heavy, furious sigh. I have seen a lot of terrible things in my 4 decades on the street. Victor Sully began, his tone laced with a raw, undisguised disgust. But this right here is a special kind of pure, concentrated evil. The liquid you gave me contains absolutely 0 botanicals. There are no Swiss herbal extracts or expensive holistic adaptogens. It is nothing but tap water, dark food coloring, and a lethal, heavily concentrated chemical cocktail. I tightened my grip on the phone until the plastic casing cracked under the pressure of my fingers. What kind of cocktail, Sully? I demanded, my chest tightening with unbearable dread. It is a massive, highly illegal dose of haloperidol, Sully read from the official lab report, pronouncing the clinical name with cold precision. It is a severe first-generation antipsychotic medication, usually reserved for treating the most extreme cases of violent schizophrenia in locked psychiatric wards. But that is not even the worst part, Victor. The haloperidol has been deliberately cut with trace amounts of heavy metals, lead and mercury derivatives. It is a slow, methodical poison. Taken daily, this specific combination completely suppresses the central nervous system. It radically halts synaptic transmissions, causes severe chronic motor tremors, and essentially places the higher cognitive functions of the human brain into a deep, inescapable chemical coma. I stopped breathing. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. My brilliant, vibrant Diane, The woman who could effortlessly calculate complex structural load capacities in her head, the woman who painted beautiful watercolor landscapes on the weekends. She did not have rapid onset dementia. She had not suffered irreversible neurological damage from a tragic tumble down our oak staircase. She had been chemically lobotomized. Preston was not treating her tragic illness. He was actively causing it. He had been keeping his own mother trapped in a chemically induced vegetative state for 7 agonizing years, just to simulate the devastating symptoms of late-stage Alzheimer's disease. He needed her legally incapacitated to maintain absolute control over my construction empire, and he needed me entirely consumed with grief and caretaking, so I would never look closely at the company ledgers. The horrifying reality of the last 7 years crashed down upon me like a collapsing steel skyscraper. Every day, Preston had walked into this house wearing a tailored suit and a perfect, dutiful smile. He had patted my shoulder, offered false words of comfort, and watched me cry. Then he had walked into her bedroom and administered the poison that was stealing her away from me. He had done it all for absolute control. "Thank you, Sully," I whispered into the phone. "Send the encrypted digital file to the secure server address I provided. Keep a hard copy locked in your safe." "I will guard it with my life, Victor." Sully replied, his voice firm and resolute. "Give the bastard exactly what he deserves." The call disconnected with a sharp click. I placed the phone gently on the nightstand. I stood up, walked to the window, and stared out at the sprawling lawns of my estate. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a bright, deceivingly cheerful light over the neighborhood. I felt a sudden, violent pressure building deep inside my chest. The walls of the room seemed to tilt and blur. I sank to my knees on the thick carpet, leaning my forehead against the cold glass of the window pane. And then the dam completely broke. I broke down in silent, agonizing tears. My shoulders shook violently as massive, silent sobs tore through my fragile, aging frame. I wept for the 7 years of life my wife had been brutally robbed of. I wept for the thousands of hours she had spent locked inside her own mind, screaming in the dark, while her own flesh and blood forced poison down her throat. I wept for the utter, devastating failure of my own fatherhood, for raising a monster so devoid of empathy that he could torture the woman who gave him life. But as the tears flowed down my weathered cheeks, the searing core of my structural engineer's logic began to harden into something entirely new. The grief was necessary. It was the final purge of the naive, trusting father I used to be. By the time I finally stood back up from the floor, my eyes were completely dry. The tears were gone, replaced by a cold, absolute, merciless determination. I knew exactly how to trigger a controlled demolition, and I was going to bring his entire stolen empire crashing down directly on his head. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon, casting long, pale shadows across the manicured lawns of my estate. I remained by the window for a few more minutes, letting the cold reality of my new existence settle deep into my bones. My wife had been systematically poisoned under my own roof by the son we had raised. I walked out of the guest bedroom and stepped into the long hallway. I stopped at the top of the grand oak staircase. I stood perfectly still, staring down at the polished wooden steps. 7 years ago, I had found Diane lying at the bottom of this very flight of stairs in a twisted, broken heap. Preston had been the one to call the ambulance. He had told the paramedics that she must have tripped on the loose edge of the Persian runner rug. I had blamed myself for years, agonizing over my failure to secure a simple piece of fabric. I had let the guilt eat me alive. Now I looked at those steps with a completely different perspective. The narrative was shifting, mutating into something far more sinister. Before I could process the rising tide of dark thoughts, the burner phone in my pocket vibrated again. I pulled it out, expecting Sully to be calling back with more toxicological details. Instead, the screen displayed an unknown encrypted number. I pressed the phone to my ear, remaining completely silent. Mr. Vance, a quiet, tense voice spoke through the line. It was Dr. Lin. He was the brilliant young neurologist who had reviewed Diane's blood work 2 days ago and urged me to investigate her sudden decline. "I am calling you from a secure, untraceable line." He continued, his tone thick with anxiety and suppressed panic. "Are you somewhere completely private?" "Yes, Dr. Lin," I replied, stepping back into the guest bedroom and locking the heavy door behind me. "I am alone." "What have you found?" I heard the rustle of heavy paper through the receiver. "After you left my office, I could not stop thinking about your wife," Dr. Lin explained, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. The heavy metal toxicity in her initial screening made absolutely no medical sense for a standard neurodegenerative disease. It kept me awake. I knew her primary physician was a close personal friend of your son, and I knew that meant the current medical records were likely compromised. So last night, I bypassed the current digital files entirely. I used my administrative clearance to physically access the deep storage hospital archives. I went all the way back to the very beginning. I pulled the original admission files and the raw, unedited radiological scans from the exact day she was brought into the emergency room 7 years ago. I held my breath, gripping the edge of the wooden desk. "What did the original scans show?" I asked, my voice barely a steady murmur. Dr. Lin exhaled a long, shaky breath. "When a patient suffers a severe fall down a flight of stairs, the resulting physical trauma presents in a very specific, chaotic pattern," he explained meticulously. "We see random contusions, varied fractures along the extremities, and impact damage consistent with tumbling and striking multiple angled surfaces. Your wife did sustain those types of secondary injuries. However, the initial point of impact, the primary trauma that caused her brain to swell and put her into a coma, did not come from striking the wooden steps or the floor below. I isolated the high-resolution cranial X-rays taken within the first hour of her admission. There is a distinct localized fracture at the upper base of her skull. It is a concentrated point of blunt force trauma." I closed my eyes, feeling a wave of absolute nausea wash over me. "Speak plainly, doctor," I commanded, my voice turning to steel. "Tell me exactly what you are implying." The specific fracture pattern on the back of her skull was caused by a direct heavy strike from a solid cylindrical object. Dr. Lin stated, his words landing like physical blows to my chest. "It occurred mere seconds before the tumbling injuries. Mr. Vance, your wife did not slip on a loose rug. The physical evidence is completely irrefutable. She was struck violently from behind, and then she was pushed down that staircase." The silence in the room became utterly deafening. The pieces of the 7-year-old puzzle violently slammed together, forming a picture of pure, unadulterated evil. Preston had not just capitalized on a tragic accident to steal my wealth. He had actively orchestrated the entire event. He had tried to murder his own mother. When the blunt force trauma and the subsequent fall failed to kill her, leaving her in a vulnerable, comatose state, he had simply adapted his horrific plan. He had stepped in as the devoted, grieving son, taking control of her medical proxy and bringing her back to this house. He had used his connections to hire corrupt physicians, effectively sealing her inside a chemical prison to ensure she could never wake up and testify against him. He had lobotomized her with antipsychotics and heavy metals because a dead woman could not sign over an estate, but a medically incapacitated one could be controlled indefinitely. The sheer, terrifying magnitude of his sociopathy was beyond anything I could have ever imagined. He had looked me in the eyes, hugged me, and watched me cry for my wife, knowing the entire time that he was the one who had cracked her skull and pushed her into the abyss. "I must truly thank you for your immense and selfless courage, Dr. Lin," I whispered into the phone, my voice completely devoid of any remaining warmth. "You have risked your entire medical career to bring me this truth. I will ensure that you are completely protected when the inevitable fallout begins. Keep those original archived files entirely secure. Do not digitize them, and do not ever speak of this to anyone else. I will contact you when it is time to move." I ended the call and placed the burner phone gently onto the polished wooden desk. I stood entirely alone in the quiet guest bedroom, breathing in the cold, stagnant air. The paralyzing grief that had suffocated my spirit for 7 long years was utterly eradicated. It was entirely burned away, replaced by a massive, endless, consuming fire of absolute vengeance. My son was not a misguided opportunist. He was a calculating, remorseless predator who had attempted to murder the woman who gave him life solely to feed his insatiable greed. He had stolen her voice, her mind, and her freedom, locking her inside a waking nightmare while he paraded around the city, spending the wealth I had built with my bare hands. I turned and looked out the window, staring at the long driveway, where the transport ambulance was scheduled to arrive in less than 3 days. Preston believed he held every single advantage. He firmly believed I was a defeated, clueless old man waiting to simply die. He had absolutely no idea that his meticulously constructed stolen empire was already turning rapidly to ash. I stood perfectly still in the guest bedroom, letting the horrific revelations from Dr. Lin settle into the marrow of my bones. My wife had been brutally assaulted, pushed down a flight of stairs, and chemically paralyzed by our own son. The sheer, suffocating weight of this reality threatened to crush me, but the burning inferno of vengeance kept my mind razor-sharp. As I stared at the locked bedroom door, a single solitary word began to echo relentlessly through my consciousness. Key. It was the only word Diane had forced past her chemically damaged vocal cords during her brief window of lucidity. In the agonizing panic of that night, I had assumed it was a fragmented plea, a desperate request to lock the door and keep her monster of a son away. But Diane was a brilliant, highly methodical woman. She possessed an analytical mind sharp enough to rival any forensic accountant. She did not waste energy on vague pleas. She was giving me a very specific, critical directive. She was telling me exactly where to look. My gaze drifted toward the heavy oak wardrobe in the corner of the room. When Preston had forcibly relocated me to this guest suite, he casually ordered the movers to pack up my belongings, along with a few of Diane's oldest, seemingly worthless personal items that he deemed unsuitable for the pristine master bedroom. Among those discarded items was her thick navy blue winter coat. I walked over to the wardrobe and pulled the heavy woolen garment off its wooden hanger. I ran my trembling fingers along the dark fabric, feeling the familiar texture she had worn during our evening walks through the snowy neighborhood. I moved my hands down to the deep interior lining of the left pocket. I pressed my thumb against the thick seam at the very bottom, searching for the tiny, almost imperceptible tear she had deliberately created decades ago. My breath hitched in my throat as I felt a small, hard, metallic object resting deep inside the hidden fold. I carefully pinched the fabric, working the object upward through the torn lining until it slipped out into my waiting palm. It was a small, intricately carved brass key. I closed my fist tightly around the cold brass, my heart hammering a furious, uneven rhythm against my ribs. I knew exactly which lock this specific key belonged to. I waited patiently until the late afternoon, monitoring the live surveillance feeds on my encrypted tablet. The digital screens confirmed that Preston was still firmly entrenched at his corporate headquarters in the city, and Valerie had driven off to a luxury spa to indulge in a lavish, deeply undeserved massage. The massive house was entirely empty and cloaked in a heavy, oppressive silence. I slipped out of the guest bedroom and moved stealthily down the long, carpeted hallway toward my old home office. This was the room where I had spent countless nights building my commercial construction empire, a room Preston had arrogantly commandeered to manage his aggressive, highly leveraged hedge fund. I stepped inside the sprawling space, ignoring the pretentious modern art and imported leather furniture he had installed to erase my legacy. My focus was locked entirely on the massive floor-to-ceiling oak bookshelf that spanned the length of the far wall. When I originally designed and built this estate 40 years ago, I had engineered a highly secure, deeply concealed compartment directly into the foundational framework of the house. It was a structural secret known absolutely exclusively to me and Diane. I approached the far-right section of the towering oak bookshelf. I dropped to my knees on the hardwood floor, pressing my hands against the thick, decorative wooden baseboard that ran seamlessly along the bottom of the heavy shelving unit. To the untrained eye, it was simply a solid, immovably fixed piece of architectural trim. But my hands knew the exact pressure points. I placed my fingers beneath the subtle lower lip of the oak trim and pushed upward with a firm, deliberate surge of strength. The hidden internal latches disengaged with a series of dull, heavy clicks. I gripped the edges of the baseboard and pulled it smoothly away from the wall, exposing the dark, narrow void concealed between the floor joists and the structural beams. I reached my arm deep into the dusty, cold darkness of the hidden cavity. My fingers brushed against the familiar cold steel surface of a heavy lockbox. I gripped the sturdy metal handle and dragged the heavy box out into the dim light of the home office. I set it down carefully on the expensive Persian rug, wiping away a thick layer of accumulated dust. The lockbox had sat completely undisturbed in the darkness for 7 long years. I took the small brass key from my pocket and slid it into the narrow keyhole. It fit with absolute, flawless precision. I turned the key, and the heavy internal locking mechanism released with a sharp, satisfying snap. I flipped the metal latches and slowly pushed the heavy steel lid open completely, unsure of the horrors I was about to uncover. The box was packed to the brim, with thick, incredibly detailed files, organized meticulously in Diane's precise, undeniable handwriting. I pulled the first stack of documents from the steel container, my hands shaking violently as my eyes scanned the top page. They were comprehensive, highly sensitive bank statements from my commercial construction firm, dating back precisely to the months immediately preceding Diane's devastating fall. But these were not the sanitized, heavily manipulated ledgers Preston had been showing me. These were the raw, unedited internal financial records that Diane had quietly gathered. I flipped through the heavy pages, staring in absolute, unadulterated horror at the endless columns of bright red ink. Preston had not just been making poor business investments. He had been executing a massive, coordinated, and breathtakingly arrogant embezzlement scheme. The documents proved that my son had systematically drained millions in liquid capital directly from the operational accounts of my construction empire. The true scope of his unimaginable betrayal deepened with every single page I turned. Preston had funneled the stolen millions into his private, aggressively reckless hedge fund, desperately chasing massive returns in highly volatile offshore markets. The records detailed staggering losses. He had completely decimated the stolen capital in a matter of months. But he did not stop there. To desperately attempt to recoup the massive financial hemorrhage, he had leveraged the pristine, debt-free commercial properties of my construction firm. He had quietly taken out massive, heavily penalized secondary mortgages. The lender listed on the shadowy, unregulated contracts was not a legitimate financial institution. The documentation Diane had uncovered proved that Preston had borrowed millions in heavily leveraged capital directly from a violent underground criminal syndicate. He had literally mortgaged our family empire to a ruthless cartel to cover his own pathetic failures. Diane had found out. She possessed the proof to destroy his fabricated kingdom entirely. Preston tried to violently murder his own mother to cover his massive thefts. When she miraculously survived the brutal fall down our oak stairs, he chemically silenced her. I stared down at the damning stack of financial ledgers and illicit mortgage contracts, the cold steel of the lockbox pressing against my knees. The air in my home office felt unimaginably heavy, thick with the suffocating gravity of a 7-year-old murder attempt. Preston had not just betrayed my trust. He had shattered the fundamental laws of nature, attempting to crack his own mother's skull to conceal his colossal cartel-funded failures. When her sheer will to live thwarted his lethal push down our oak staircase, he simply pivoted to chemical warfare, transforming her into a silent, vegetative hostage. I carefully packed the irrefutable evidence back into the steel container, my hands moving with the precise mechanical efficiency of an engineer preparing a demolition sequence. I slid the box back into the dark void beneath the floor joists and snapped the heavy oak baseboard flawlessly into place. The physical evidence was finally secure, but the burning inferno in my chest demanded immediate, calculated action. It was the morning of the third day. My 72-hour window was rapidly closing, and the transportation team was scheduled to arrive tonight. I retreated to the guest bedroom, locking the heavy door firmly behind me. I booted up the encrypted tablet, watching the glowing grids of the live surveillance feeds. The house remained deadly quiet. Valerie had left early for a high society brunch, and Preston was allegedly at his downtown headquarters, though the live feed from my old home office proved otherwise. He was sitting behind my mahogany desk, rapidly scrolling through his laptop, his face a tight mask of absolute paranoia. He was sweating profusely, loosening his silk tie as he frantically reviewed his digital accounts. Preston had always been a man consumed by his own fabricated brilliance, constantly terrified that his house of cards would collapse under the slightest gust of wind. He knew the cartel was running out of patience, and he desperately needed the funds from my estate to appease them. I watched him on the tablet screen, noting the nervous, erratic twitch in his jaw as he reviewed his shadow files. I needed to ensure the audio feed in the office was perfectly calibrated to capture any phone calls he might make to his underground associates. I tapped the highly sensitive audio synchronization icon on the glass tablet interface. It was a microscopic, seemingly insignificant error, born of pure, exhausted adrenaline. In my sheer, unadulterated focus, my finger brushed against the diagnostic reset toggle. A sudden, sharp gasp caught in my throat as the tablet screen flickered violently. Across the house, in the ceiling of the home office, a microscopic red light pulsed vividly to life directly behind the slotted plastic vents of the smoke detector. It flashed twice, casting a brief, brilliant ruby glare into the dim shadows of the room. Preston froze instantly. The frantic clicking of his laptop keys stopped dead. He slowly raised his head, his dark eyes locking precisely onto the ceiling fixture. The remaining color drained completely from his face, replaced by a cold, predatory realization. He knew. In that single fraction of a second, the elaborate charade we had both been playing completely evaporated into the stale morning air. He stood up slowly, never breaking eye contact with the hidden camera lens. He did not shout. He did not tear the smoke detector down from the plaster. He simply smiled, a terrifying hollow stretching of his thin lips, and walked calmly out of the home office. The tablet screen showed an empty room, but the silence radiating from the device was entirely deafening. My pulse hammered a violent rhythm against my ribs as I waited for his next move. I knew my son better than anyone else in this world. He would not call my phone to negotiate a peaceful surrender. He would not demand a lengthy explanation or attempt to spin another web of lies. He would immediately accelerate his timeline and eradicate the threat with extreme, uncompromising prejudice. I securely tucked the encrypted tablet under my mattress and slipped a heavy steel wrench into the deep pocket of my trousers. I unlocked the guest bedroom door and walked out into the long, silent hallway, taking up a defensive position near the top of the grand oak staircase. The agonizing wait stretched through the remainder of the morning. Every single tick of the antique grandfather clock in the foyer sounded like a heavy iron hammer striking an anvil. I listened to the wind howling against the window panes, praying for strength. At exactly noon, the heavy brass deadbolt on the front door clicked sharply. The massive oak door swung open, hitting the wall with a violent, resounding crash that echoed throughout the entire estate. The pristine facade of the dutiful, grieving son was entirely and permanently gone. Preston strode into the grand foyer, his face locked in a murderous, uncompromising glare. Valerie trailed nervously behind him, her usual polished arrogance completely replaced by twitching, frantic anxiety. She clutched her designer handbag against her chest, like a shield, her eyes darting wildly around the empty foyer. But they were not alone. Flanking them were two massive, heavily tattooed men, dressed in pristine white medical scrubs. They did not look like specialized psychiatric nurses. They moved with the heavy, disciplined gait of seasoned cartel enforcers, their eyes scanning the architecture of the house with cold, tactical precision. The thick muscles of their arms bulged against the thin cotton of their sleeves, and their posture screamed of impending lethal violence. The transport team had arrived 8 hours early, and they had absolutely no intention of taking my wife to a legitimate hospital. Dad Preston barked, his voice echoing up the staircase with a harsh metallic edge. I stepped out of the shadows and stood firmly at the top of the stairs, looking down at the monsters invading my home. I did not slouch. I did not tremble. I stood tall, rolling my shoulders back, letting the 70-year-old victim persona burn away into ash. "I see your appointment schedule has miraculously opened up." "Preston," I replied, my voice echoing back down to him with absolute unwavering authority. Preston glared up at me, his jaw clenching so hard I could hear his teeth grinding together. "The game is completely over, old man." Preston snarled, taking a single aggressive step onto the bottom stair. "We are not waiting until tonight. The medical transport has arrived to collect my mother, and you are going to stand aside and let them do their job. If you interfere, the nurses have strict authorization to medically sedate you for your own safety." I looked past him to the two massive enforcers, who had already reached into their scrub pockets, producing heavy pre-filled syringes. "They are not taking her anywhere," I stated coldly, gripping the wooden banister with a hand that had spent 40 years forging steel and concrete. "She is staying exactly where she is, and you are going to leave this property immediately." Valerie let out a high, hysterical laugh, stepping out from behind her husband's broad shoulders. "You are completely delusional, you old fool." Her expression twisted into a grotesque mask of arrogant amusement. She did not just smirk. She radiated a toxic, triumphant joy that made my stomach churn. For years, she had played the role of the dutiful, loving wife and caretaker, pouring coffee and offering sugary smiles while secretly plotting the demise of the very woman who had welcomed her into this family. Now standing in the foyer of the house my money had built, flanked by cartel enforcers disguised as medical professionals, she finally let the venom seep through her polished exterior. "You are completely delusional, you old fool," she repeated, her voice dripping with absolute contempt. "Do you honestly believe you have any power left in this situation? You are just a pathetic relic standing in our way." She crossed her arms, leaning her weight onto one hip, thoroughly enjoying the spectacle of an old man supposedly facing his absolute ruin. She genuinely believed I was entirely broken, a fragile artifact ready to be swept into the dustbin of history, alongside my poisoned wife. I looked past her painted face and focused my unwavering gaze directly on Preston. My son stepped forward, his massive frame deliberately blocking the entire width of the grand oak staircase. He positioned himself like a prison warden, cutting off any potential avenue of retreat or escape. The two heavily tattooed men in pristine white medical scrubs mirrored his movements, shifting their weight and sliding their calloused hands into their pockets, their fingers undoubtedly curling around the heavy pre-filled syringes they had prepared for my wife. The air in the foyer grew incredibly dense, suffocatingly tight, with the promise of impending violence. Preston stared up at me, his dark eyes entirely devoid of the boy I had raised, devoid of the young man I had sent to university, devoid of any shred of human empathy. He had fully embraced the monstrous persona he had cultivated in the shadows. He puffed out his chest, adjusting the collar of his expensive dress shirt, preparing to deliver his final crushing blow to the father he despised. He took another step up the stairs, closing the physical distance between us, attempting to use his youth and vitality to force me into submission. But I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I stood anchored to the hardwood floor, channeling 40 years of ruthless corporate negotiations into my posture. Seeing that his physical intimidation was failing to produce the desired terror, Preston decided to deploy his carefully constructed public narrative. He turned his head slightly toward the open front door, raising his voice to an artificially booming, theatrical volume. He wanted the two cartel thugs to hear it, and he wanted any neighbors walking their dogs or checking their mailboxes to hear it as well. It seems the dementia must be completely contagious, Preston announced loudly, his voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings of the foyer, with a sickening, manufactured sorrow. This stress is just too much for his fragile mind. He is having a total psychotic break, Valerie. He needs to go to the psychiatric ward with Mom. They can share a room and receive the specialized cognitive care they both desperately require. The sheer audacity of his lie was breathtaking. He was actively laying the groundwork to have me permanently institutionalized right alongside Diane. He was painting a tragic, highly believable picture for the outside world of a devoted son forced to make the agonizing decision to commit both of his beloved parents due to rapidly advancing, synchronized neurological decay. It was a flawless, impenetrable cover story designed to hand him absolute, uncontested control over the entirety of my estate. Valerie nodded in exaggerated, loud agreement, playing right along with his twisted pantomime. "It is so tragic, Preston," she called out, projecting her voice toward the open doorway. "We have to do what is best for them, even when they do not understand it themselves." But the theatrical performance ended as quickly as it had begun. The moment the loud, dramatic words left his mouth, his whole demeanor shifted. The fake sorrow vanished from his eyes, replaced by a cold, calculating malice. He lunged up the final 3 stairs, moving with terrifying, predatory speed, and crowded directly into my personal space. He grabbed the fabric of my cardigan, with both hands, pulling me roughly forward. I let him pull me, ensuring he felt the illusion of physical dominance. He leaned his face in so close to mine that I could smell the stale coffee and bitter mints on his breath. His lips brushed against my ear, and he lowered his voice to a harsh, barely audible whisper that sent a shard of pure ice directly into my spine. "You are going to hand over the original asset documents right now, old man," Preston hissed, his voice vibrating with lethal, unrestrained aggression. "I checked the proxy papers you signed. You deliberately botched the signature block. You used your old invalid corporate variant. Did you really think my lawyers would not catch that pathetic little trick before we went to the bank? I know you have the primary titles and the raw financial ledgers hidden somewhere in this sprawling mausoleum. You are going to walk me directly to them, and you are going to sign them over legally, flawlessly, right this very second. If you do not comply, this entire narrative changes tonight." He tightened his violent grip on my collar, his fingernails digging painfully into my collarbone. "This house has incredibly old, highly unpredictable gas lines, Dad," Preston whispered, every single syllable dripping with murderous intent. "It would be a catastrophic, devastating tragedy if a massive explosion suddenly leveled the entire property while we were out finalizing the psychiatric transfer paperwork. A tragic, unpredictable accident, killing a crippled mother and her senile, helpless husband in the middle of the night. It would be such a terrible shame, but these things happen to old houses. No one would ever question the structural failure." I stared into the black, soulless eyes of the man I had helped bring into this world, feeling the cold steel of the heavy wrench resting deep inside my trouser pocket. He had fully confessed to his willingness to burn his own parents alive simply to cover his staggering financial failures. There was absolutely no shred of humanity left inside him to salvage. I did not break eye contact as his foul breath washed over my face. I needed to keep him completely focused on me, completely confident in his fabricated superiority, so he would not notice the silent blinking light of the micro-camera mounted perfectly within the smoke detector directly above his head. He had just delivered his ultimate murderous threat on a crystal-clear audio feed that was currently transmitting directly to my secure offshore servers in real time. The trap was now fully complete. Every single piece of leverage he thought he possessed was completely worthless. I very slowly raised both my trembling hands in a calculated, highly feigned gesture of absolute, utter submission and total surrender. "Okay, Preston," I whispered, letting a single tear fall. "You win." Preston released his violent grip on my collar, a sickening smile of absolute triumph spreading across his face. He smoothed the wrinkled fabric of his expensive dress shirt, stepping back with the arrogant swagger of a conqueror who had just claimed his ultimate prize. Valerie let out a long, theatrical sigh of relief, dropping her designer handbag onto a nearby chair and crossing her arms. The two massive cartel enforcers remained perfectly still, their cold eyes darting between me and the heavy wooden doors leading to the master suite, entirely ready to carry out their grim medical duties. Preston extended his hand, palm facing upward, demanding the physical documents he believed would save his pathetic, crumbling empire. He did not yell. He did not need to. He thought he had already won the war. He expected me to drop to my knees, beg for my life, and drag him to the hidden compartment where Diane had stashed the raw financial ledgers. He expected the broken, grieving father he had been manipulating for 7 long years. But I did not yell, and I certainly did not beg. I took a slow, deliberate step backward, creating a small pocket of space between myself and the predators invading my home. I reached my right hand into the pocket of my trousers. Preston tensed for a fraction of a second, his dark eyes narrowing, perhaps anticipating that I might pull out a weapon or the keys to a safe. The two men in pristine white medical scrubs shifted their weight, their hands moving deeper into their pockets, ready to plunge their lethal syringes into my neck if I made a sudden move. Instead of drawing a weapon, I simply pulled out my encrypted mobile phone. I held the smooth glass device in my palm, keeping my thumb resting gently over the main interface. Valerie rolled her eyes, scoffing loudly at the sight of the device. "Who are you going to call, old man?" she mocked, her voice dripping with pure, unadulterated venom. "The police will never arrive in time to save you or your miserable wife. You are entirely alone." I did not grace her pathetic taunt with a response. I kept my gaze locked onto my son, maintaining a mask of terrified submission while my mind operated with ice-cold mechanical precision. With a single fluid motion, I pressed a highly specific, predetermined sequence of numbers on the illuminated touchscreen of my phone. I entered the final digit and tapped the execution command. For 3 agonizing seconds, absolutely nothing happened. The grand foyer remained perfectly quiet. Preston let out a harsh, barking laugh, shaking his head in mock pity. He took another step forward, raising his hand to snatch the phone away from my grasp. Then the entire architecture of the estate responded. It began with a deep, resonating hum that vibrated through the hardwood floors and rattled the crystal chandelier hanging high above our heads. A loud, mechanical grinding noise echoed from deep within the walls of the sprawling house. Before Preston could even register the shifting atmosphere, the heavy security mechanisms I had meticulously installed decades ago violently engaged. Thick, reinforced steel shutters, my own custom military-grade hurricane-proof designs, suddenly dropped from concealed housings above every single window and exterior door. They slammed down with a deafening, terrifying crash that shook the foundation of the house. The bright midday sun was instantly and completely obliterated, plunging the entire foyer into a harsh, artificial gloom, illuminated only by the dim emergency backup lights. The massive steel plates locked into their floor anchors, with a series of heavy metallic thuds sealing the house like an impenetrable fortress. The sudden, violent sensory deprivation caused an immediate wave of pure panic. Valerie screamed a shrill, piercing sound that bounced off the high ceilings, covering her ears and dropping to a crouch against the wall. The two cartel thugs drew sleek, black firearms from beneath their medical scrubs, abandoning the syringes entirely, their heads snapping in every direction as they searched for an unseen enemy. Preston stood frozen in the center of the foyer, his arrogant smile completely wiped away, replaced by a mask of raw, unfiltered terror. He spun around, staring at the solid steel barrier that now covered the massive front door, realizing instantly that their only route of escape had been entirely severed. He turned slowly back to face me, the color draining from his cheeks, as the horrifying reality of his situation finally began to set in. "You are not going anywhere, Preston," I stated, my voice losing every ounce of the frail, grieving father. The hollow, defeated tone I had carried for 7 years evaporated entirely, replaced by the deep, commanding authority of a man who had built a construction empire from nothing. I stepped away from the staircase and walked calmly toward the center of the room, my posture straight, my shoulders broad. I was no longer the prey. I had just trapped the predators inside a steel cage with me. "What have you done, you insane old fool?" Preston shouted, his voice cracking with rising panic as he desperately gestured toward the armed men. "Open these doors right now, or they will kill you where you stand." I ignored his pathetic threats completely. I moved slowly toward the heavy mahogany coffee table positioned in the center of the grand foyer. I raised my left hand and methodically unclasped the heavy silver wristwatch I had worn every single day since Diane gave it to me on our 30th wedding anniversary. I pulled the metal band free and tossed the heavy timepiece onto the polished wooden surface of the coffee table. It landed with a sharp, heavy clatter that cut right through the tense, suffocating silence of the locked room. I looked directly into my son's panicked eyes, letting the full, unadulterated weight of my vengeance bear down upon him. "You forgot who built this house, Preston," I said, my voice as cold and hard as glacial ice. "I engineered every single beam, every wire, and every security protocol in this building to withstand a natural disaster. You are not dealing with a fragile old man. You are dealing with the architect of your entire existence. And more importantly, you forgot who I play poker with on Thursday nights." Preston stared at the watch on the table, his chest heaving as he struggled to process my words. "That watch is an active, highly encrypted FBI audio transmitter," I explained, pointing down at the glowing dial. "My old friend Sully is not just a street contact. He is a retired federal agent with ties to the Financial Crimes Division. Exactly 12 hours ago, Sully handed your complete, unedited cartel ledger over to a federal task force. They have been listening to every single word spoken in this room. They heard your murderous threats. They heard your confessions of corporate embezzlement, and they know exactly who you brought into my home. The steel shutters are not just here to keep you inside. They are here to keep you contained until the tactical teams currently surrounding this property breach the perimeter." For several agonizing seconds, the absolute gravity of my statement simply hung in the stagnant air of the sealed foyer. Preston stared at the silver wristwatch resting on the mahogany coffee table as if it were a live grenade. The arrogant sneer that had defined his entire adult life melted away, leaving behind the terrified, trembling visage of a cowardly boy who had finally been caught in a catastrophic lie. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to issue one final desperate threat, but the words withered and died in his throat. A low, distant wail began to echo through the reinforced walls of the estate. It started as a faint, singular whine, but within heartbeats it multiplied and amplified into a deafening, unified chorus of heavy sirens. The piercing sound tore through the quiet, affluent neighborhood, rapidly converging directly on our front lawn. The heavy, rhythmic crunch of armored tires tearing across the decorative gravel driveway vibrated through the floorboards. The tactical response I had orchestrated with Sully was not a bluff. The full, overwhelming force of the federal government had arrived to dismantle my son's fabricated kingdom. The two massive cartel enforcers, realizing instantly that they had walked blindly into a highly coordinated federal trap, completely lost their disciplined composure. These were men accustomed to operating in the shadows, intimidating defenseless victims, and enforcing underground debts. They were entirely unprepared to face a heavily armed tactical breach. They exchanged a single panicked glance before throwing their sleek black firearms onto the polished hardwood floor. The weapons landed with a heavy metallic clatter, sliding across the room and coming to a rest against the baseboard. They slowly raised their tattooed hands high into the air, interlacing their fingers behind their heads and dropping to their knees in a gesture of absolute surrender. They knew that engaging in a localized firefight with a federal tactical unit would result in their immediate violent deaths. Valerie let out another piercing, hysterical shriek, collapsing onto the bottom step of the grand oak staircase and burying her face in her trembling hands. Preston, entirely abandoned by his hired muscle and cornered by his own immense hubris, began to hyperventilate. He spun around in frantic, useless circles, desperately slapping his hands against the unyielding steel shutters covering the front doors. His pathetic, frantic attempts to find a weakness in my structural engineering were violently interrupted by the booming, mechanically amplified voice of an FBI crisis negotiator blaring through a heavy exterior bullhorn. The voice commanded everyone inside the residence to drop all weapons and surrender immediately. I calmly retrieved my encrypted mobile phone from my pocket. I did not look at my son as he clawed helplessly at the solid steel plates. I focused entirely on the digital interface navigating to the core security control application. I meticulously punched in the 12-digit alphanumeric override sequence, bypassing the lockdown protocol I had initiated merely minutes ago. The heavy internal gears ground into motion. The massive steel shutters covering the front doors and surrounding windows instantly unlocked, rising upward with a loud mechanical hum. The sudden influx of bright, blinding daylight flooded the grand foyer, revealing the terrifying, awe-inspiring sight of 24 heavily armed federal agents stacking the perimeter. Before the heavy oak doors had even fully swung open, the tactical teams flooded into the residence in a blur of dark Kevlar ballistic helmets and blinding tactical lights. The sheer velocity of the breach was breathtaking. Crisp, commanding voices filled the massive space, ordering everyone to the ground. Red laser sights painted the chests and foreheads of the intruders. The two cartel enforcers were violently subdued in a matter of seconds, heavy zip ties securing their wrists as they were dragged roughly toward the exit. Valerie was hauled up from the stairs, screaming incoherently, as cold steel handcuffs were ratcheted tightly around her delicate wrists. Preston offered absolutely no physical resistance. His knees completely buckled beneath his weight, and he collapsed onto the expensive Persian rug. Two federal agents immediately descended upon him, driving their knees into his back and twisting his arms violently behind him. As the metallic click of the handcuffs echoed through the foyer, the final shred of Preston's manufactured loyalty to his wife instantly evaporated. He violently twisted his neck, looking desperately up at the commanding officer. "It was all her idea," Preston screamed, his voice breaking into a pathetic, high-pitched squeal as he nodded frantically toward Valerie. "She arranged the cartel loans. She managed the shell accounts. She told me to silence the old woman. I am completely innocent. I was forced into this." Valerie stopped screaming. The sheer cowardly magnitude of his betrayal hit her like a physical blow. She stared at the man she had conspired with, the man she had married for wealth and status, as he desperately tried to offer her up as a sacrificial lamb to save his own miserable skin. A guttural, animalistic sound tore from deep within her throat. Ignoring the federal agents restraining her arms, Valerie lunged violently forward. She threw her entire body weight toward Preston, kicking wildly and thrashing her head. "You pathetic, lying coward!" Valerie shrieked, spit flying from her lips, as her heel connected viciously with Preston's ribs. "You pushed her down the stairs. You crushed the pills. You begged the cartel for the money to save your pathetic, failing fund. Do not you dare try to pin your pathetic failures on me." The federal agents quickly intervened, dragging the thrashing, screaming woman backward and shoving her forcefully toward the open doorway. Preston lay whimpering on the floor, clutching his bruised side, entirely stripped of his dignity, his power, and his freedom. I walked slowly across the grand foyer, my footsteps echoing with a heavy absolute finality. I stopped directly in front of the man who had tried to murder my wife and steal my legacy. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely no pity, no regret, and no sorrow. The purge of my paternal naivety was completely absolute. I crouched down slightly, ensuring my face was the only thing he could see. "You thought you were so incredibly brilliant, Preston," I said, my voice dropping to a low, unforgiving register that only he could hear over the chaotic shouting of the federal agents. "You thought you had orchestrated the perfect, undetectable crime. You thought you could simply silence your mother, sedate your father, and walk away with a massive multi-million-dollar empire to fund your pathetic, hollow existence. But you fundamentally misunderstood the very foundation of this entire family. You underestimated the intelligence of the woman you tried to kill, and you underestimated the absolute, merciless resolve of the man you tried to rob." Preston looked up at me, his eyes brimming with a desperate, pathetic hope. I leaned in, dropping the final devastating bomb on his shattered reality. That absolute power of attorney you forced me to sign is legally void, I whispered coldly. I used my designated corporate duress signature. You get absolutely nothing today. He was dragged away facing massive federal charges for attempted murder, severe elder abuse, and underground racketeering. The heavy steel doors of the transport van slammed shut, swallowing the frantic screams of the son I once loved. I stood on the cold gravel of my driveway and watched the flashing red and blue lights disappear into the distance. The suffocating nightmare that had consumed my entire world for 7 agonizing years was finally over. The intense rush of adrenaline slowly faded, leaving behind a profound, resonating exhaustion that settled deep into my bones. The massive estate behind me, once a monument to my success, now felt entirely hollow. It had been the silent stage for a gruesome betrayal, a place poisoned by Preston's relentless greed. I knew I could never live within those walls again. I simply could not bear to walk past the grand oak staircase where my beloved wife had suffered so deeply. Every single room in the house was permanently tainted by the lingering echo of their insidious lies. I sold the property the very next month, liquidating the physical reminder of his cruelty. I relocated to a quiet coastal property far removed from the toxic shadows of the city. The gentle, refreshing ocean breeze helped to clear my mind and heal my exhausted spirit. I focused every ounce of my energy and resources on the singular, most important objective remaining in my life: rebuilding the shattered pieces of my family. The days immediately following the arrests were filled with endless meetings with federal agents and corporate lawyers. I surrendered every document, every recording, and every piece of financial evidence I had gathered. The authorities were stunned by the sheer scale of the embezzlement and the intricate web of deception my son had woven. The subsequent legal proceedings had been entirely brutal. The prosecution systematically exposed their vast, intricate network of deceit. I had stood in the packed courtroom watching silently as my former son tried desperately to manipulate the jury. He presented countless fabricated stories, attempting to cast himself as the tragic victim of unfortunate circumstances. But the raw, unedited financial ledgers and the pristine audio recordings completely destroyed his fragile defense. Preston and Valerie were currently languishing in maximum security holding cells, their bail firmly denied by a federal judge who recognized the sheer magnitude of their flight risk. They were awaiting their inevitable lengthy federal prison sentences, stripped of their stolen wealth and their fabricated dignity. The underground cartel syndicate had been utterly dismantled by the financial task force, and the stolen assets from my construction firm had been meticulously traced, frozen, and entirely recovered. I spent countless hours working alongside federal auditors to rebuild the structural integrity of my company. We purged the toxic elements and restored the foundation of trust with our legitimate partners. My business was now completely secure, standing on solid ground once again. 6 months later, the chilling winter air had surrendered to the bright, forgiving warmth of an early spring morning. I walked through the sliding glass doors of the serene, sunlit Neurological Rehabilitation Center, carrying a steaming paper cup in my right hand. The sterile, depressing environment of the previous corrupt medical facility was entirely gone. This place was a sanctuary of healing filled with vibrant green plants, open spaces, and dedicated professionals who actually valued human life. My true victory was waiting for me at the end of the bright corridor. I approached the open doorway of the private corner suite, my heart beating with a steady, hopeful rhythm. Diane was sitting in a comfortable armchair by the large window, bathed in the soft golden light of the morning sun. The pale, lifeless pallor that had haunted her delicate features for 7 long years had completely vanished. Her skin held a healthy rosy color, and her posture was relaxed, supported by her own recovering strength rather than artificial restrictive restraints. It had taken months of rigorous, grueling medical intervention to slowly and safely flush the lethal cocktail of heavy metals and first-generation antipsychotics from her fragile system. There were days of terrifying uncertainty, agonizing moments when I paced the hospital waiting rooms fearing the chemical damage was permanently irreversible. The doctors had warned me about the unpredictable nature of severe neurological trauma. But my brilliant, remarkably resilient wife had fought her way back from the suffocating darkness with a silent, ferocious determination that had deeply humbled me completely. I stepped softly into the quiet room. Diane turned her head toward the sound of my footsteps. Her beautiful eyes, once clouded by a thick, unnatural fog, were completely clear and radiantly alive. They sparked with the sharp, analytical intelligence I had fallen in love with 4 decades ago. The profound recognition in her gaze was an absolute miracle. I walked over and gently placed the warm paper cup on the small table beside her. I had prepared the coffee exactly the way she preferred, stirring in precisely 2 packets of raw sugar and a small splash of cream, just as I had done every morning before the accident. She looked down at the cup, then slowly reached out her trembling fingers, brushing softly against my weathered hand. The simple, innocent touch sent a profound, healing warmth directly into my fractured soul. She wrapped her fingers around the warm cup, steadying her grip, before lifting it carefully to her lips. She took a slow, deliberate sip, closing her eyes for a brief moment, to savor the simple, reclaimed pleasure of a familiar routine. Then she lowered the cup and looked directly into my eyes, a familiar, teasing smile playing on her lips. "Victor, this coffee is a bit weak today." A sudden, overwhelming wave of pure emotion crashed through my chest, shattering the final remnants of my stoic facade. The simple, beautifully coherent sentence was the greatest sound I had ever heard in my entire life. I knelt down beside her chair, wrapping my arms gently around her shoulders, as hot, silent tears finally spilled over my cheeks. I held her close, feeling the steady, reassuring beat of her heart against my chest. All the wealth in the world, all the commercial properties and businesses I had ever built, meant absolutely nothing compared to this singular, perfect moment. We had survived the ultimate betrayal. We walked through the darkest fires of hell and emerged on the other side, completely unbroken. The long, terrifying nightmare was finally finished. I knew the road to full recovery would still require immense patience and unwavering dedication, but we would face it together. The tears were no longer born of paralyzing grief or suffocating despair. They were tears of absolute unfiltered joy. I rested my forehead against hers, breathing in the scent of her hair, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing. I had lost a monster, a cruel and irredeemable predator, who had disguised himself as my own flesh and blood. But in the ashes of that devastating betrayal, I had fought the hardest battle of my life, and I had gotten my brilliant, irreplaceable wife back. We would leave this city completely. We would find a small house near the ocean, where the air was perfectly clean, and the past could not ever reach us.
I used to ride upon your shoulders, thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years leads me home. He taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lies within me like an echo, calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, child, you're stronger than you know. I am my Father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. One day the snow will cover footprints, one day the fire will burn low, but the things a father gives his daughter are the things that never go. Not the gold or not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my Father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every loss, through every joy and every pain, the world may change around me, the stars may fade above, but I will always carry with me my Father's endless love. And when they ask me who I am, I'll smile and answer softly.